We began Wednesday evening by saying, and I say it again, unapologetically, and with assurance, did you get that one? I forgot that last night, so I told him that if I forgot to come up and do it. I've got written right there at the top, tapes. I didn't do it. At any rate, the statement I made, and now I'll go ahead and elaborate on it, is that evolution is a philosophy. Evolution is a faith. It is not science. I know there are people that would take issue with that statement. I do not believe they can do so successfully by any fair measure. Remember that statement we had from George Gaylord Simpson, who has been known for most of this century as Mr. Evolution. And he said, that which cannot be checked by observation is not science. All of the essential features of evolution cannot be checked by observation. Here are some areas in which indeed it is faith. The evolutionist has faith in a beginning that he did not see, that he cannot demonstrate, that he cannot repeat. He believes that elements chance together in the right combination under the right circumstances and popped into amino acids which formed proteins which formed eventually a living cell. That has nowhere been observed. It cannot be demonstrated. And yet the evolutionist believes in that. That which cannot be checked by observation is not science, George Gaylord Simpson of Harvard University said. Then there is the evolutionary faith in all of the intermediate life forms that do not exist in nature now, and they exist nowhere in the fossil record. We saw Charles Darwin admit that. We saw evolutionist after evolutionist today admit that. And because now the weight of that evidence is weighing upon them, and if you don't understand what I'm saying, let me mention again that the only history that we have of what has happened is in the rocks. And the evolutionist has made the rocks his playground, as if that was his field of evidence. But those who believed in the Bible long ago recognized that the fossil record did not belong to the evolutionist, but to the one who believed in creation. But what is not in the rocks, that is, there is no fossil showing one form of life in the process of turning into another form of life. There is no intermediate form between any of the forms of life that exist upon the earth today or that ever have existed. The evidence is totally and underscored, totally lacking. Of the billions and billions of fossils that we have, not the first record has been found of one life form in transition turning into something else. We can find all of the forms of life as they are now. We can find some forms that are extinct. But there are no intermediate life forms to be found. Why? The obvious reason is that they just did not exist. Now, that has caused a great deal of turmoil in the theory of evolution today. And while Charles Darwin depended upon natural selection to bring into being new forms, later evolutionists said natural selection may eliminate some forms, but it cannot originate anything. It cannot put a trunk on a horse and make it an elephant. So neo-Darwinists came along and they said mutations occurred, and then natural selection did away with those we should not have lived. But through the study of genetics and our knowledge of DNA, we know that through mutations you cannot bring into existence a brand new character. All you can do is alter the character of a life form. Little Drosophila, the fruit fly that they've worked with so much, they can rearrange the hairs on his legs, they can grow a foot where a mouth should be. They can change the pattern of webbing in his wings, but they can't put radar on him. They can't go roller skates on him. That's just impossible to do with life forms. Mutations can only change the form of whatever the animal or plant has. It cannot bring into existence a new form, and that's what evolution needs. There's a whole school of evolutionists now are saying that neo-Darwinism is wrong, Darwin was wrong, and they've issued such papers as, "Shall we burn Darwin?" Now this doesn't mean they're going to give up evolution. They are devoted to that. But Darwin is now being repudiated, as other philosophers have in the past that spoke so authoritatively that so many men listened to. But this is the second thing the evolutionist has faith in. He has faith that all of those different animals or all of those different plant forms, in between the various plant forms and animal forms that we have today, he has faith that they lived. But he cannot produce the first one or a fossil of the first one. He has faith in the gaps that are there. And because there is no mechanism that even the new evolutionists can use to explain what triggers one life form so that it changes into another form and gives it the ability to develop new characters which will cause it to become a different kind of animal. What can cause an alligator to make the changes sufficient to become a bird? The neo-Darwinists said, as I noted just a moment ago, that mutations did that. But the new evolutionists, through the study of genetics and working with DNA, know that that is not possible. They don't know. They have no idea. We saw one man, Professor Goldschmidt, at the University of California in Berkeley, saying, perhaps something like this happened. One day a reptile laid an egg and it hatched a bird. He doesn't know, and that's the only explanation that he has. But you see, that's a matter of faith. Nobody has ever seen that. No one has ever seen, even working with Drosophila, where they can go through 40 generations in a few weeks, and they've been working at it for decades. How many millions of generations then have they gone through? And they've never been able to produce a new character, a new ability in little Drosophila. So we say evolution then is a matter of faith. And let me give you briefly now those three things again. The evolutionist believes in a beginning that he did not see, that he cannot demonstrate, that is unrepeatable. That's faith, my friend. The evolutionists believe in the existence of all the life forms that were necessary to get from the alligator to the bird, the apes, the man, but he doesn't have a record of any of them. None of them exist. And to believe in them is faith, my friend. And then he believes that there is some mechanism which he cannot explain, which Professor Murray Eden says the evolutionist must await new, undiscovered natural laws to know how these changes took place. If they are undiscovered natural laws, if they are new to man, and he doesn't even know that they exist, but he believes they're there, that's faith. Now, I'm not saying that evolutionists aren't scientists. Many scientists, most scientists, are evolutionists. I believe there's a reason for it. I believe, as one evolutionist said, some very popular biologists are evolutionists, and they have been able to extend their influence. And there's a kind of inquisition. You just do not have any influence in biology if you don't believe in evolution. Most scientists are evolutionists, but when they leave investigation, when they leave experimentation, and they become apostles and evangelists of that which they cannot demonstrate and show by observation, they are not then in the capacity of scientists. They are then in the position of apologists for a human philosophy. And that's what evolution is. It is not a science. And I have made that statement each night. And maybe I've said it enough that you can just repeat it by rote. And I hope you can. And I hope you tell people that. And you youngsters, don't feel bad about telling your teachers that in school. Bring these points up to them. And if you want some help, I'll be able to come to your classroom, I'll write letters to your teacher, I'll do anything I can to take the pressure off of you and to show that teacher that he is not teaching the science. And as I said at the outset, I say that unapologetically, I say it without fear of successful contradiction. Evolution is not a science. Evolution is a philosophy. It is a faith. That was the lesson the first evening. The second evening we looked at the biological evidences of evolution. And we saw them wanting. The next evening we looked at geology and paleontology, and we saw that that was a catastrophe equally as well for the evolutionist. His proof is not there. Tonight we'll take a look at the field of anthropology, simply the study of man. And we're going to ask, what about the ape men? What about the cave men? Is proof or is indication of evolution there? We can ask the question with the psalmist of old, what is man? And I suppose you might say, well, he's a creature with 2 arms, 2 legs, on the trunk of a body, topped by a head, and he's taller than he is wide. Well, that as well describes a gorilla, and obviously that doesn't tell us all that man is. To an evolutionist, man is an accident. I suppose a kind of cosmic joke on matter. Here is matter that somehow gets together and forms life and works itself up to man, and then man turns around to the matter and he beats and he molds and he cuts it, he enhances it, and sometimes he degrades it as he drives down the street throwing his beer bottles out and as he pollutes his own atmosphere. C.S. Lewis was asked one time if he shouldn't pay more attention to the reasoned conclusions of the materialists, the humanists. C.S. Lewis, incidentally, was of Cambridge University, a man of impeccable intellectual credentials, but he believed firmly in God, as many other scientists have that I've mentioned to you in this series of lessons. But I want to remind you of something else before I give you Mr. Lewis's answer to that question. In all the authoritative quotations that I have given you, which have repudiated every aspect of evolution in biology and in geology, every one of those authorities repudiated every facet of evolution were evolutionists themselves. I have not quoted the first believer in creation. And I pointed that out the first evening. That whatever area of evolution you want to look at, whether it's mutations or whether it's natural selection, or whatever, you will find astute scientists who will say that doesn't work, that is wrong. And in the positions they take, other scientists will tell them they're not wrong, and as we've observed, they're both right. I just do not believe that evolution is so, for many good reasons we've not covered in this series of lessons. We have covered some in past lessons, and maybe in the future we will cover some more. But we've been taking a look at evolution to see whether or not, as our advertisement said, are the answers in. And for the evolutionists, the answers are certainly lacking. Now, as far as the question to C.S. Lewis, shouldn't he pay more attention to the reasoned conclusions of the materialists? And he said, why should he? That collection of atoms that makes up the brain of that materialist tells him is an accident. The whole reasoning process is something that has come into being by accident, so why should he pay any attention to that? And he pointed out that really the logical outcome of evolution is that there are no absolute laws. There are no laws of general application. Now that's something that most people have come to believe today. And that philosophy is really rooted in the idea of evolution and those ideas which naturally follow. A materialistic philosophy. And that's why, if the average man doesn't know why he believes that, he may believe it just because it's convenient and allows him to do whatever he wants to do. But the philosophical basis for that is simply the theory of evolution. The evolutionist then looks at man as an accident that is here, and what's going to happen when the universe comes to an end or burns out. And it will. It's going to. One evolutionist said pathetically, then man and life will simply be as a match that was struck in the darkness and extinguished. Now that's all the significance man has if the theory of evolution is so. Something that just accidentally came into being. He flamed for a moment. He's extinguished with the rest of the universe. And what difference did it make that he ever existed? Not one whit in the scheme of things. In fact, there would be no scheme anymore. Man was of absolutely no significance, and is not, if the theory of evolution is so. But we can look at the Word of God. We turn to Genesis, the 1st chapter, and unashamedly so. Look at verses 26 and 27 and find there the words of God as He said, let us make man in our likeness after our image. The verse goes ahead to say that in the image of God created He him, that is man, male and female created He them. Jesus stated when this was done in Matthew the 19th chapter, verses 4 through 6, He says, in the beginning God created them male and female. Man has a significance. He has been made in the image of God. Obviously, it's not God's physical image. God does not have physical being. In Luke the 24th chapter and verse 39, Jesus talked about the qualities of spirit. And He said on another occasion, John 4 and verse 24, that God is spirit. When Jesus appeared in the midst of His disciples after His resurrection, they thought they saw a spirit. And Jesus said, a spirit doth not have flesh and bones as ye see me having. And thus if we are made in the image of God, it is not the fingernails and skin and the hair that is in the image of God. It is that spiritual quality that is in man that is in no other creature that has been made in the image of God. But man has spoiled that image of God that was in him through his sin, and yet there is certainly still hope for him through Jesus Christ. But in Ecclesiastes, the 12th chapter, verse 7, it says there of man that as he dies, the dust returneth to the dust whence it came, but the spirit unto God who gave it. You know, isn't that an interesting statement? That this body shall return to the dust from whence it came. I wonder how Moses knew what the human body is made of. The human body is made of the elements, the chemicals that are to be found in the elements of the earth. We're made of the same things. When I was in school, those elements were worth about 98 cents. That's what man was worth chemically. Now, with inflation, I think it's $3 and something. We're getting worth a lot more. But we are made from the very elements of the earth, and Moses stated that a long time ago. Then there is Zechariah 12 and verse 1, which speaks of Jehovah who formeth the spirit of man that is in him. In Hebrews 12 and verse 9, God is spoken of as the Father of spirits. And in 2 Peter, the 1st chapter and verse 4, we read that we may become partakers of the divine nature through the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Man has significance when he studies the Bible. He has been made in the image of God, and though he has spoiled that enemy within himself through sin, it can be restored, and he has the hope of eternal life. Now that doesn't say anything about which idea is true, creation or evolution. But I can see that one certainly ennobles man and gives him purpose in existence, and the other one simply makes him an accident. And really you can impose on man no rules by anybody else. Who has the right to make rules? Where would rules come from in the first place if the theory of evolution is so? And as we look at the Word of God, we find, and I shall emphasize this later on in the lesson, man being civilized from the beginning. All authorities are agreed today that civilization started about 5,500 years ago in the Mesopotamian Valley, and that's where the Bible places the Garden of Eden. And man did not start out as a crude being. He started out knowing about animal husbandry. That's what Abel did. He started out knowing about agriculture. That's what Cain did. He started out knowing about fire because they were offering sacrifices. In the early generations, we find them using instruments of music. We find them making cutting instruments of brass and iron. Man began as a civilized being. Man did not begin as an unenlightened inhabitant of the jungle. Well, don't we have evidence that people have come from very crude circumstances? Indeed, we do. And we want to address that subject also later on in our lesson. Well, why don't we take care of that at the present time? You'll see a National Geographic special on television. You'll get materials from Time Life. And they will show the peoples who lived in the past and the crude of their circumstances were the longer ago they were supposed to have lived. What about the Aborigines living today in Western Australia? What about the Digger Indians in the last century? That when our forefathers found them out west, they had no tools except a simple snare for birds and a stick to dig roots with. And Mark Twain described them as the most despisable of all creatures in their ignorance and in their crudity. Not even to a stone age yet. And what about the Tusade in the Philippines, the island of Mindanao, separated a couple of hundred years ago from the rest of their fellows, isolated in a valley and cut off for 200 years, and they're not even up to the circumstances they were living in when they were cut off. And the rest of their fellows continue to make progress. National Geographic has done a feature on those people saying they are Stone Age people. And as you read the article, indeed, they're living just like the cavemen that we hear supposedly preceded civilized man. The assumption of the anthropologist is that if you find man living in crude circumstances, he must have lived before a man who lives in more refined circumstances. And you see the fallacy of that, because while we have people living in more refined circumstances someplace in the world, we also find people still living in extremely crude circumstances in many places in the world. And this statement from Lord Raglan in the book, How Come Civilization? And he's talking about the degeneration of isolated peoples. And how I believe these cavemen, if you want to call them that, came into being is that man started off as a civilized being, but perhaps as Cain, some were banished, some were left behind, some were pushed from without civilization and stripped of that they had had before, and lacking the initiative and the ingenuity to make the things and the implements. They simply spent their times hunting. They tried not to prove themselves. And when a group of people isolated from everybody else does that, what they tend to do is simply degenerate. But listen to Lord Raglan's statement. He says, all the available evidence suggests that no savage society, if left to itself, has ever made the slightest progress. The only change that takes place in isolated societies is change for the worse, which says you can start off with civilized beings, isolate some of those people, and take away from them the implements of their civilization, and what they're going to do is degenerate. And the Tusade people in the Philippines today are an example of that very thing happening. In 200 years, they went from a civilized people back to a Stone Age existence. But can't you see some anthropologist 100,000 years from now exploring the Philippines, or maybe the Aborigines in Western Australia, the Digger Indians in the Western United States? And he says, well, you look at this, Back in the 20th century, man was still living in the Stone Age. What's wrong with that? While some were living in Stone Age circumstances, others were living in refined circumstances. But that's what we do. That's exactly what we do. We find people living in crude circumstances, and based upon the presupposition of evolution, we decide that those people lived before civilized peoples. And if there's anything we saw in our lesson last evening, as we looked at the geological column, I hope you know and understand that there is no reason to conclude that. Even when you look at fossil evidence, the fossils are not lined up in the Earth's soil. Nowhere will you find that geological column intact. It comes from taking a fossil here and saying that belongs here, and taking a fossil from here and saying that belongs there. And then they line them up the way they want them, built upon the presupposition of evolution, and they find somebody living in cave circumstances and they put him down here. Upon that basis, and that basis alone, and it is certainly not a conclusive position to do that. What about the 8 men? You know, I would like to ask the question, why do you call anyone 8 men? There are people who have different configurations from the way most of us do today, but you can look around this room and you can find different configurations, and you can find different skull types and different kinds of physiques. Anthropologist Arthur Custon says that he can change the shape of the skull of a population in one generation simply by taking away its knife and its refined cooking abilities, and leave them to eat tough meat, simply taking hold of it with their teeth and tearing the flesh from the bone. And stronger muscles are going to have to develop around the eyes and the heads, which will form an orbital arch. And within a generation's time, starting with the young, he can change the shape of the skull. And when we find some of these skulls that we look upon as prehistoric, there's no reason to believe it's prehistoric. Indeed, it does have the arches, but they're there not because they lived far earlier than somebody else. They are simply there because of the uncivilized habits that characterize them. Different skull types? Yes. Skull types we look upon as crude. I don't know that Adam looked like Robert Redford. I don't know that Eve looked like Farrah Fawcett. And then again, they might. I have no idea I don't know what color their skin was. But they were fully as intelligent as we are. There are plenty of anthropologists who look back and they finally have declared that as far back as we can find civilized man, he has been fully as intelligent as he is now. And when we first find civilized man, the bases of culture that we had built upon was all in existence at that particular time. We do not find a slow evolution of the developing of the culture of man. We find culture. And at the same time, we can find people living in crude circumstances with nothing to bridge the gap. So evidently what happened was that man began as a civilized being, populations being isolated, degenerated, as we have Lord Raglan pointing out just a few moments ago. But I want to take a look at this that I have on the board. Up until 10 years ago, this was the lineage of Homo sapiens. That's what we are. And sometimes the way we behave, maybe that ought to be Homo sapiens. But it started off with Java man, or Pithecanthropus erectus, and Peking man, or Cyanthropus, Heidelberg man, Neanderthal man, Cro-Magnon man, and then finally Homo sapiens. I'll be kind and not spend a lot of time on Piltdown man, which was supposed to have gone in here and has been proved to be a fake. And I have no question but what the rest of these, without too much more time, are likewise going to be declared the same thing. Now, I want to go through this carefully, and I want you to understand that what I'm doing is not simply popping off, it's not giving a hasty conclusion that I have come to. What I'm going to tell you has come through lengthy study and searching several sources, evolutionary sources. I'll quote many evolutionary sources again this evening. about these men and about fossil men and men that are supposedly prehistoric. But I want to emphasize that I have stood in the Field Museum of Natural History and seen the skulls, or at least casts of these skulls, lined up, and seen teachers bring their students through and say, this is what man one time looked like, and then he changed and he looked like that, and as he made progress he looked like that, and this, and then this, and there is nice, handsome Robert Redford, which all of us, of course, look like. And oh, what a shame that that's so. And with the passing of years, the Field Museum has had to change some of them, especially Neanderthal man. They've had to change radically. I've got a picture, if you young people want to see what Neanderthal man looked like when I was in college. Here's my college textbook, or one of them, and you can come up here and take a look at him, but I want you to listen to what some anthropologists and evolutionists themselves now admit about Neanderthal man. But I want to start off with this Java man, or Pithecanthropus erectus. He's supposedly 1 million years old, and this was the first human being. Before this, man had been ape. Now, they don't know where the link is between the apes and Java man, but this, when I was in school, and up until 10 years ago, this was supposed to be the first man with upright qualities and with human characteristics. There's some interesting things about Java man. Java man was discovered by a Dutch medical doctor named Du Bois. And against the advice of his friends, he wanted to set off in the quest for a regional man. He had been overtaken with the idea of evolution, and so he did. And he found a skull fragment. And 50 feet from there, he found a thigh bone and some teeth. He put them together as if they belonged together. And for 30 years, he didn't tell what else he found over there. He found 2 human, modern-type human skulls. But if you take the teeth from over there and the thigh bone from over there and put it with the monkey skull from over here, and you take it and you show it to your fellow scientists, what kind of greeting do you get? Well, looking at the skull at the Third International Congress of Zoology at Leiden, the consensus there was that he had simply found an extinct form of ape, and Du Bois was obviously disappointed. And for, I say, the next 28 years after that, he didn't tell about the human skulls that he found until somebody else went to the same area and they found some modern human skulls, and when he saw that they were about to announce that, he announced that he had found his too, which cast reflection upon what he had found. But do you know what happened? What he had found, first of all, got written up in Science. He presented this to his fellow zoologists, and they rejected it as being a human being. But somebody years later went into Science, and they were making up a list of these prehistoric men, and there was Java man, and he worked his way into the textbooks. And when I was in school, and up until 10 years ago, the evolutionists were talking about Java man as if indeed he were a human being. That is not scholarly. That is not science. That is not good investigation. But Carl Sagan can talk about Java man. All the other evolutionists can talk. Well, he's in the textbooks. But you see how he came to be in the textbooks. And then just before Du Bois died, knowing now that forever his reputation is going to be sealed, he admitted and he said, the first skull that I found was that of an ape. But it's still in the textbooks. It's still in the biology books. And evolutionists still talk about it. And then they are wanting to talk about scholarship, and they're wanting to talk about the scientific method. Something with that kind of basis was presented, and simply because it was in the books and it fit into their scheme, they used it. Is that the first time they've done anything like that? We saw what they did with the rock slice. Why did they put that fellow there? From this fragment of skull, and they made out a configuration of what he should have looked like not really from the evidence of the skull, but as he should fit into the scheme of evolution. That's what they made him look like. And when they find these other fellows, and they have the fragments of the skulls, and most of the time it is fragments, a jawbone, a tooth, many times, a whole being has been made from a tooth. How do you make a whole skull and arms that hang down below the knees and a foot with an opposable toe from a tooth? Because where you found that tooth, that the theory of evolution is so, man should have looked a certain way in that particular time. So they take this tooth, they make that construction of him, and they present it in the textbooks, and you look at it, and you think that's what man looked like at that particular time. Made from a tooth. There was a Nebraska man who was made from a tooth, and he was given the name Hesperopithecus, which means Western Ape Harold Cookie Eye. Named after Harold Cook, and I'm sure Harold Cook didn't want him named after him after a while. But they made a whole being from him and presented him in the evolutionary scheme of man and his development. And somebody else searching in that area again found another similar tooth in the jawbone of a pig. And so all along they had made a man from a tooth of a pig. Well, he's repudiated. You won't find him in your textbooks now. But this was happening at the same time. Some other things were happening in science, and that is old Scienthropus or Peking man. You can find him in your textbooks. You can find him in the Field Museum of Natural History. I didn't look close, but I'm quite confident you can find him over here in the American History or Natural History Museum in New York City. And there he'll be. But you know what he's made from? Nothing. The whole scheme of what he was supposedly made from is missing. Nobody knows where the fragments are. What they really found were 30 skulls, 11 lower jaws, 147 teeth. But first of all, they found one tooth. And an anthropologist went out on a limb, like they did with Nebraska man, and proclaimed what he ought to have looked like. And then they found the jawbones. Also, they found some modern type skulls contiguous to all of this, but that was forgotten about. They had to work here with old Java man, old Scienthropus, and they had him to be the first tool user, and he used fire because in these caves where they were found, there was evidence of use of fire and there was evidence of tool use. Well, there were some strange things that happened. Some of the first discoverers of this made some measurements and they sent descriptions, and the descriptions and the measurements were equivalent to the skull cap of Java man, or Pithecanthropus erectus, which was finally admitted to have been that of an ape, and when it was first presented to the scientists and zoologists, they said it was an ape. So it would seem likely, didn't it, what they found here was the skull cap of an ape. But as time went on, the fellow who had first made the whole man from a tooth made a configuration of what he was supposed to look like, and he made it a little bit more modern looking than Java man. And there were a couple of science writers then who went to that area and they saw the original bones, and they went away, and later they saw the pictures then this cast that had been made, and they saw that it was different. And so World War II was about to start, and all of a sudden all of the original bones are gone. Nobody knows what happens to them. And the story is that probably in trying to get them out of China, with the Japanese coming in to occupy that, the Japanese took it over, and supposedly there was an American submarine out there waiting to get people out of China, and they were going to put the bones on that, but somehow the bones didn't make it. And the suspicion is, among some evolutionists, that the one who had made this configuration and had become famous for it did not want the bones to get out to civilization, lest he be repudiated and they see that what he made did not match the bones that he had. Nobody knows anything. Nobody knows about the submarine. Nobody knows anything about the Japanese taking them. Nobody knows anything about the Chinese. Nobody knows anything about what happened to all of these fossilized remains. But to get back to the human skulls that were there of modern type, in that area it was discovered that there was a limestone works there. And going back and going through the evidence again, it was shown clearly that this thing that had a skull like this that was proclaimed to be an ape had his head bashed in at the base of the skull, and that's why all the jawbones were over here and just fragments of skull elsewhere. And there is the unanimous opinion that somebody had killed all these all these Peking men and eaten their brains. Well, that doesn't sound tasteful, but I guess anybody who eats hog brains shouldn't get too upset about that. There's too much behind that, let me tell you about that. But the question is, who killed Peking man? Well, obviously somebody a lot more powerful than him. And you've got these skulls of a modern type human being there who had the rock works there, and you put the two together, it would seem likely to conclude that they preyed upon this kind of monkey, which was a gibbon, whatever that, I should look that up today, see how you say that monkey's name, and ate his brains, and that's why all his remains were there. But regardless, those who first examined the skull and knew what it looked like, and then they see what was made from it, and there was no correlation, and then all the bones end up missing, but there he is. And I read about him in some recent material, his latest again, still talking about Peking man in Time magazine of 3 years ago. And I'll show you how foolish that's going to be in just a moment. Well, Java man, evidently, according to the best evidence, was simply an ape with some human parts put with him, which is really what happened to Piltdown man. Peking man, probably the same kind of ape. There were human beings living there at the same time. Obviously, it's not the human beings' ancestors because they are the human beings there. Heidelberg man, there's a strong jawbone is all they have found, but it has a receding chin, and when they draw him, they of course emphasize the receding chin. But people have receding chins today. If any of you have receding chins, be careful where you're buried. You don't want some anthropologist digging you up in 1,000 years and putting you back here in the beginning somewhere, but that's what they did with Heidelberg man. And why do they put these people where they put them? They arrange them with the presupposition of evolution, again, the same way they do other fossils. And then we come interestingly to Neanderthal man. And I've told you youngsters that you can come over here and take a look at how Neanderthal man is represented when the service is over. And he is a fearsome looking creature. His knees are bent, and we're told that when he walked, his knees knocked together and his arms hang way down low and his head projects way out in front of his body. I don't know what kept him from tilting over. Well, there are some interesting things we found about Neanderthal man. In the first place, he was discovered in about 1840 at Gibraltar, but he wasn't named until there were several more of them found in 1856 in the Neander Valley. T.H. Huxley, looking at the remains, said he looked like a slightly exaggerated form of living Australians. Anthropologist Pruner Bay looked at his skull with a low brow and said that he resembled Irish stock. But later, I hope we don't have Irish people here tonight. Later he was described, after these initial examinations, he was later described as bestial, gorilloid. Darwin spoke of his enormous projecting canines, these teeth in the side of your mouth. In 1956, 18 college textbooks were studied. 9 said he couldn't straighten his knees. 4 others said he slouched when he walked. 8 said that his head projected forward. 2 remarked of his being ape-like. But in 1956, they were going to celebrate the centennial of the discovery of Neanderthal man. And Professors William Strauss and J.E. Cave, in preparation for that, asked for the first specimens that had been stored away all of these years, and when they saw the specimens, they were shocked. They were pathological specimens, and it was Paul Amos Moody at the University of Vermont in his book, Introduction to Evolution, which said that this first specimen was suffering from rickets, and that's why the condition in his knees. Others have taken a look at it and said he was suffering from arthritis. But all the rest of the specimens they have showed that Neanderthal man is essentially like we are today. But there he is in the textbook. Now I say again, that is not scholarship and that is not science. But the theory of evolution has been taken so for granted that astute men, intelligent men, brilliant men, scientific men can swallow things like that upon the flimsiest of evidence and pass it on to their students. And I know the effect that it had. One time I was in a meeting in Indianapolis, Indiana. And some people had brought a youngster with them, and on the way home, that youngster says, well, those cavemen did exist. My teacher showed me pictures of them. The same kind of pictures that you're going to find in my textbook over here. And I want to read to you then some other things that others happen to say about Neanderthal man. And this is from Ashley Montague, which ought to set, I think, the picture in order. Owing to want of a little knowledge of elementary anatomy, some of these authorities, he's talking about these people who construct these, who have engaged in reconstruction of Neanderthal man, have presented him with a bull neck, grotesque features, and walking with a stoop, during which it was alleged his knees knocked together. It has also often been asserted that Neanderthal man must have been of low intelligence because he had a low forehead. All these slanders are indefensible. Neanderthal man walked as erect as any modern man. He did not have a bull neck, and he was not knock-kneed. And it has long ago been proved by many independent scientific investigators that the form of the brow or of the head has nothing whatever to do with intelligence. As a matter of fact, we have very good reason to believe that Neanderthal man was every bit as intelligent as we are today. We find that he was a sensitive person. He buried flowers with his dead. We found altars where he has worshipped. He has been a religious person. He is not some benighted creature living back in our past, as some authorities today have made and brought him up to Homo sapiens and just said that he is one of us. But you'll still see television programs representing Neanderthal as one of the progressions in the development of man from the apes to what he is today. That's indefensible, and he certainly doesn't look as he has been represented to look. Then that brings us to Cro-Magnon man. You've seen the paintings on the walls of the cave in France and other places. Exceptional ability as an artist. Better, if I might interject a little prejudice here, than some things you're going to see in the Museum of Modern Art, which is just art for art's sake. You know, if a fella does something art for art's sake and he just splashes something, and let him keep it at home. Let him not put it out here and think that I'm supposed to come and ooh and ah over that thing. I wonder, what do they represent? This is going to take about 30 seconds. I know I'm off my subject. But I came to the conclusion, I don't think they represent anything. I'm not talking about some abstract art, which has its place. I'm not particularly fond of it. But I mean the stuff that's just splotchy stuff. And it's called the Dada School of Art. And what that is, that's French for rocking horse. And the idea behind it was that the artist, who doesn't believe in God, is allowing whatever truth there is in the universe just to flow through him. So he sticks his fingers in paint, or his brush in the paint, and here he goes. And he ends up, and he has expressed the truth of the universe. And to find a name for that particular kind of art, they just opened up the French dictionary and put their hand on the word, and it was Dada, or rocking horse. So that's what they call that art. Well, Cro-Magnon man far surpassed that in his abilities. And he was supposedly some sort of benighted being, but now some authorities are also bringing him up to Homo sapiens. What does that do with all that? Now that's the way it was in my textbook in school. And I think I have a right to be a little bit angry for being misled like that, having that palmed off on me. But it didn't stop there. It's been in my youngsters' textbooks, and I think I have a right to be a little bit angry when this stuff has been in my youngsters' textbooks. An ape, a man, a man, a man. And here we are today. And they have been made with the configurations that they have to fit the theory of evolution. Yes, some of them may not have had the refined shaped skulls that we have today. If they saw us, they would think, my, what puny looking heads those people have, I would suppose. But you know, all of that was made academic by the work of the Leakeys in Africa. Louis Leakey came up with Zinjanthropus, and he proclaimed that from many little fragments of skull found over a wide area, and he got together and he worked out a configuration of these fragments and presented that to the scientific world. And for 2 years, that was the immediate successor or antecedent to Homo sapiens. And then everybody decided he was an ape because there were a couple of Yale paleontologists who were studying, and they found the first man. And what they found was a section of a jawbone and a few teeth. And the picture in Time magazine was of a hairy creature and long arms again and an opposable toe. Well, surely you could tell all of that from part of a jawbone and a few teeth, couldn't you? Well, they did, and that's the way it was presented. And that was the first man. But he didn't last very long. And Richard Leakey, I think, probably has the latest word now with his Homo habilis over in Africa. And do you know what he's found? He and his mother, wife of Louis B. Leakey, who has passed away now, using their dating system. And I want you to know now, and remember from our study last evening, there is no justification for using their dating method. But using their dating method in the strata where they find Homo habilis, that makes him, and they say that he is essentially like we are today, that makes him 3.5 million years old. Or their dating method makes him 3.5 million years old. Now this whole scheme had man just emerging from the apes at 1 million BC. I saw a movie when I was a kid, 1 million BC with Victor Mature. They got rolled over by dinosaurs. I remember that scene. But according to Richard Leakey, here is man as we are today 3.5 million years ago. Obviously, these are not the ancestors of man. If here we are, back there 3.5 million years ago. Something wrong somewhere in the kind of reasoning that evolutionists have used in trying to reconstruct and show us what modern man is like. I want to read to you about these reconstructions. This is from the book Fossil Men, which is an evolutionary source. What's done when they take fragments and they put together what a human being is supposed to look like, or even a skull? Listen. Can we go still further and restore the plastic form, that is the nose and the ears and the shape of the skin? Can we present a portrait of Neanderthal man as he was in life? The artist is at full liberty to attempt to produce works of imagination, original in character and striking in appearance, but men of science and of conscience know too well the difficulties of such attempts to regard them as anything but pastimes and recreations. But they are taken seriously, and they're in the textbooks, and evolutionists will talk about them, and they're on children's cartoons, and they're on serious documentary television programs. But here's what a scientific evolutionary source has to say about such recreations. Well, let me see what I want to say about Zinjanthropus. I think I'll let that rest and go ahead, or not Zinjanthropus, but Homo habilis. Incidentally, if you want to look at it, here's his picture on the front of Time magazine. Of course, there's a lot of imagination that goes into that. But what I was interested in is to get over here and find the antecedents to man. You can't see it from back there, I know. But you know back here that Java man's not there, Peking man's not there, Heidelberg man's not there, Neanderthal man's not there, and Cro-Magnon man's back there. In fact, of the three figures that are human, there's no antecedent to them. There are other lines of apes, and they're succeeding along parallel to man, and that's what this shows. This shows that man exists as far as back as the apes, which we once thought were our ancestors. Now, Leakey is an evolutionist, but he has presented the world with a problem, and he realizes it has. And he said in a speech in California, he knows he stripped science of this, and he doesn't know what to give them in his place. But he has found man as far back as the apes were. And the picture here, as they show the development of man, conveys that idea. They've got one fellow back there called Ramapithecus, which they suppose to be our ancestor because he's just cruder than we are, but there's no evidence to link us together. Well, we've been looking at anthropology. I want to get to this, and then we'll bring our study to a close. And what I want to say is this, that wherever we have found life, as far back as we can find life, we have now found evidence of man, not in just the quaternary area, as we saw last night, which was the very top of the list that we looked at in the eras of man's existence here upon the earth, but he was found by a man in the Cambrian, down here where life first began, as the geologist and paleontologist lines up his fossils. And when he finds fossils of a certain classification, he puts them down here, because in his evolutionary scheme, that's where it belongs. He wouldn't dare put it up here. Why does he put it there and not there? Because in the evolutionary scheme, it belongs there. And that's the way they date them, and what they rely upon heavier than they do radiocarbon or carbon-14 or anything else. But this man that I told you about in 1968 was looking for trilobites. Now, the trilobites became extinct in the Cambrian era. And he found a rock that looked as if it had a fossil of a trilobite in it. And he broke the rock and it split handily in two, and there he found the trilobite which he thought he had seen impressed in the heel of a footprint of man. Now, man was not supposed to live for 600 million years yet. But there he found evidence of man. This man was an evolutionist. And from his study of it, he was able to decipher and discern that the trilobite was alive when this man crushed it with his heel. He gave up the theory of evolution. He said evolution cannot be so. That same thing happened to a biology teacher in Decatur, Alabama, who saw the evidence that man lived at the same time as dinosaurs, and before he saw the evidence, he says, if that's so, evolution can't be so, and he saw that there was evidence of man living right with the dinosaurs, and he gave up evolution. There are some people that just see and say that the trilobite became extinct back here and man was there, man lived back as far as he did, man didn't descend then from one-cell organisms up to trilobites, up to the fishes, and on up to the scale to humanity. So man has been found there in 1968. He's been found in the Cretaceous. We talked about that last evening as we found the footprints of human beings in association and contiguous to footprints of dinosaurs. Incidentally, sometimes people say, do you believe in dinosaurs? Yes, I believe in dinosaurs. I've got some bones, and I believe in dinosaur bones. I dug them out of a place where they had taken whole dinosaur structures. Skeletons is a better word. And I didn't have to dig very deep to find them. We'd go along, just watch for protrusions from the earth and dig away a little bit. Sure enough, we'd find a fossilized remain, dig more, and then we could pull the bone out. And I've got some. I'm thoroughly convinced that what happened to them? They became extinct. Lots of animals have become extinct. The whooping crane, if the government hadn't stepped in, would be extinct. The buffalo, if the government hadn't stepped in, would be extinct. We have all of these endangered species that we're trying to keep from becoming extinct. Dinosaurs lived, dinosaurs became extinct. The only problem is that man lived at the same time the dinosaurs did. And you youngsters, if your teachers start teaching you that man lived 70 million years after the dinosaur became extinct, tell them no, there's evidence in the Biloxi River Valley near Glen Rose, Texas, that man and dinosaur lived together in the same stratum. I mean, feet and inches apart are human footprints and dinosaur footprints. Well, we can find man back in Carboniferous times. Footprints of man in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri. This is just when, according to evolution, the pine trees were beginning to emerge. And we saw Albert Ingalls' statement last night in the Scientific American that if these rather attractive possibilities are really human footprints, then the science of geology is so wrong that geologists should all resign their jobs and go to truck driving. But we've also seen that the new evolutionists are saying that the whole study of geology has been built upon a false premise. And that we do not need, the mathematicians especially are saying, we do not need all of these long periods of age They say even they are not long enough for Darwinian evolution to work. Evolution must have worked at a more rapid rate. There was this animal, and poof, he became this sort of animal, is the way they're saying it now. And so they indeed are attacking indirectly the whole foundation of historical geology as it has been understood until just recent times. And yet, in spite of all of that I can read, I came across this. I was studying two books at once. They're evolutionary books. One is Geology Today, published in 1973, and the other is Fossil Men. It was first put out in French and then translated into English. And I came across this statement in Geology Today, and it says, there are no ancient fossil men in North America. And I was astounded. I had just been reading in Fossil Men of fossilized men in the United States of America, or in North America. So I turned back over there to see what I could find out about all of that, and here's what I found. Yes, out near Omaha, Nebraska, there was a skull found that had great thickness of skull bone and had a strong orbital arch, and it had a low receding forward. It was found in the Pleistocene stratum, which put it 3 million to 25,000 years ago. Found in the same stratum, incidentally, as Java Man. But because it resembled the remains of some Indians that were buried not far away, they decided not to accept that as a fossil find, even though it was found in what they would term the Pleistocene stratum. And so what we've got here in the United States, he's America. You find him over there in Java, and he's the first man to emerge from the apes. Incidentally, they didn't look alike. This one, I say, looked like Indians, and so they rejected him because he did not fit into the evolutionary scheme. Then there was Minnesota Man, found also in the Pleistocene, would have been dated 1 million years old. He was Mongoloid type, similar to the Eskimos. Presented to the authorities, and they rejected it. And they rejected it on this basis that there was no geologist present at the excavation. It didn't help that he could take them and show them where he got the skull. They said, I'm sorry, we weren't there, and it doesn't fit into our scheme. This fellow that looks like Eskimos cannot be 1 million years old, and where you say you found him would made him 1 million years old, so we don't believe you found him there. And so no wonder then Geology Today would say there are no fossil remains on the North American continent, because they just nicely get rid of all of them like that. I want to give you a couple more. In Calaveras, California, there was a skull found, several skulls of modern type. After digging through layers of lavas and gravels of the Pliocene age, which would, according to the evolutionary scheme, make what is found there 12 million years old. But what they found here in this gold mine, in this stratum, which they would date at 12 million years old, were skulls of a modern type. And so the geologists, considering that, seeing that didn't fit into their scheme, said this is probably a practical joke on the miners. But to what point? Those miners certainly weren't sophisticated enough to even appreciate such a hoax. Who is going to take skulls and bury them to fool somebody who doesn't know anything about geology? There was another skull found in that same area in 1855, possessing absolutely modern characters, but it was rejected. The geologist in charge says it requires a total lack of critical sense to pay any heed to such a piece of evidence as this. You see, when they find what they think they want to find, or something small they can make look like what they want it to be. Now, I know that's a strong charge, but I'm convinced of it. And you can read it in the material, and you can read it in their own books. Take the book Fossil Men, if you please, and you'll see what I'm telling you. Then they put it where they want it. But let somebody find something where they don't think it belongs, and they find a reason for rejecting it. There is the Pexpan Man, and he was found in the Pleistocene in a stratum that would put him 3 million years old. But this was before Richard Leakey came along, so they weren't ready to accept that a modern type man lived 3 million years ago. And so the reason for rejecting him was fossil men must be different from modern men. And there just is no objectivity to all of that. And there's just inconsistency. That's not scholarship. That's not true investigation. That's not accepting empirical evidence. That's rejecting everything that doesn't fit into your theory and doing what you can with everything else to make it fit into your theory. Now, if I sound hard on this particular aspect of evolution. I think it's got it coming because of the way it has presented itself in my textbooks and my children's textbooks, and what it has done to the thinking of a whole generation of youngsters who swallow evolution because they know those fellows live. Their teachers have shown them pictures of them. Well, let's bring this to a close. I want to do it by reading once more this statement of Pierre P. Grasset, one of the most distinguished of French scientists. In his significant work, The Evolution of Life, Professor Dobzhansky of the United States of America, reviewing Professor Grasset's book, says this. Now, Dobzhansky is a neo-Darwinist evolutionist. He says the book of Pierre P. Grasset is a frontal attack on all kinds of Darwinism. Its purpose is to destroy the myth of evolution as a simple, understood, and explained phenomenon. That's in quotes. That's what Grasset said his work was. To destroy the myth of evolution as a simple, understood, and explained phenomenon, and to show that evolution is a mystery about which little is and perhaps can be known. Dobzhansky says, now one can disagree with Grasset but not ignore him. He is the editor of the 28 volumes of the Traits of Zoology, author of numerous original investigations, and ex-president of the Academy of the Sciences. His knowledge of the living world is encyclopedic. And this man who has those credentials says in closing this book, it is possible that in this domain, that is to say where life came from and how life is developed, it is possible that in this domain biology, impotent, yields the floor to metaphysics. That is a non-natural, natural, or supernatural explanation of origins. And I've got reason to believe that the one in the Bible is so. It says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And in the beginning God made man in his own image. And I'll stand there for numerous reasons. Evolution has nothing to offer me. Evolution is a faith. It's a philosophy. Evolution is not a science. You people have been so kind to listen. Each night I've preached for over an hour. Every night. And if you want to call it preaching, that's all right with me. I have given you authorities. My reading has been extensive enough, I think, to make the case that we intended. The authorities that I have quoted you have been evolutionary authorities. And I think you're ready to see and understand that evolution is not a science. It is a philosophy. It is a fact. If there is one here tonight who has not obeyed God and would do so and come to Christ and give him his life and be baptized for the remission of sins, we invite you to come. All together we stand and sing.